It is a marvel of technology, spectacular in terms of sight, sound, and sheer power. It is perhaps one of the greatest inventions of mankind. Though its origins are humble, it has evolved into some of the largest and most complicated machines of destruction ever made. Big Guns, next on Tales of the Gun. At one time, it was a dream as wild and fantastic as traveling to the moon. The notion of a gigantic weapon that could fire large projectiles over vast distances. Today's highly advanced artillery is a fulfillment of that dream. The result of a long line of invention and innovation dating back almost 700 years. Before then, one of the only large weapons at the disposal of an attacking army was the catapult. These cumbersome devices, used from the time of the Romans until the early 14th century, propelled enormous rocks, large arrows, flaming projectiles, and even the carcasses of diseased farm animals.
Germ warfare is not new, and these animals, as they hit, would open up, and germs would spread, and contagion would develop in an enemy city or inside an enemy castle.
A new solution was desperately needed, and by the late 1200s, an invention was being talked about that would dramatically transform human history. The actual inventor of gunpowder remains a mystery. What is known is that the first written reference to gunpowder is dated 1242 and credited to a Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon. In his paper to the Pope entitled Opus Tertius, Bacon talks about the flaming and flashing of certain ingenious mixtures.
When a quantity of this powder, no bigger than a man's finger, be wrapped up in a piece of parchment and ignited, it explodes with a blinding flash and a stunning noise. Roger Bacon, 1267.
Yet one of Bacon's books contained a strange anagram that wasn't deciphered until the 19th century.
But of saltpeter take 7 parts, 5 of young hazel twig and 5 of sulphur. And so thou wilt call up thunder and destruction if thou know the art.
Bacon was the first to record in writing the formula to gunpowder. But he wasn't willing to risk his life divulging the information. In 1139, the Second Council of Lateran, an advisory board to the Pope, called for death to any person who made fiery compositions for military purposes. So Bacon kept the secret of the black art to himself. Yet by the early 1300s, an unknown experimenter was already using the explosive force of gunpowder to shoot a projectile from a hollow pipe. And by 1346, the first cannons were being put to use on the battlefield. In the Battle of Crécy, King Edward's troops struck terror into the French army with these strange and bizarre tubes of thunder. It was the beginning of a new era in warfare. By the 15th century, armies across Europe regularly employed cannons that could fire stone balls weighing 200 pounds.
There's a good argument to be made for the role of gunpowder and the guns that used it in overthrowing the medieval social order, which was based in part on the impregnability of castle walls. Cannons destroyed that impregnability and essentially required a rethinking of the ways in which places were to be defended.
During the siege of Constantinople in 1451, Muhammad ordered the casting of 16 massive guns that were 18 feet long and could blast 25-inch boulders into the city.
It wasn't too long that the siege made breaches, made great jagged holes in the walls of Constantinople. The Turks came in and the city fell. This signaled to all the world, and to Europe in particular, that castles were no longer inviolate. And you could argue that artillery pieces changed the scope not only of warfare, but of Western civilization itself.
From west to east, the race was on to forge giant behemoth cannons. In 1548, the Great Gun of Bijapur was created in India. Its 28-inch caliber barrel and 80-pound charge allowed it to fire a 1,000-pound stone. 20 years later, in 1568, Imperial Russia unveiled one of the biggest guns ever built, the Tsar Pushka, otherwise known as the Great Gun of Moscow. Its 36-inch bore gave it the distinction of being the largest caliber gun made until World War II. It was an enormous weapon which could fire a 2,400-pound projectile. Great strides were also being made in the science of artillery. The first book ever devoted to the subject was written by the Venetian mathematician Niccolo Tartaglia. Published in 1537, his La Novecento Invento outlined, among other things, the duties of a gunner.
A gunner ought to be sober, wakeful, lusty, hardy, patient, prudent, and a quick-spirited man. He ought also to have good eyesight, a good judgment, and perfect knowledge to select a convenient place in the day of service to plant his ordnance where he may do the most hurt unto his enemies and be least annoyed by them.
Tartaglia's text also included a warning.
Because the fume of saltpeter and brimstone will otherwise be hurtful to his brains. So it is very unwholesome for him to shoot any piece of ordnance while his stomach is full. Niccolo Tartaglia, Venice, 1537.
Tartaglia was the first to observe that the faster the velocity of a projectile, the flatter the trajectory, and that the maximum range of a gun would be achieved at an elevation of 45 degrees, a theory that would remain unchanged for hundreds of years. The next significant innovation of big guns was in the use of stronger metals, which allowed guns to be packed with even greater charges of powder. One of the first conflicts to fully utilize these more powerful modern weapons was the American Civil War. The Parrott, one of the first rifled guns, was used mainly by the North and had an extra piece of metal shrunk onto the back of the gun. This was intended to give the weapon added strength because of the high risk of explosion. Other guns, such as the Rodman, were some of the largest artillery pieces of the time.
It had a rather unique shape, sort of like a Coke bottle, and it could withstand tremendous internal pressures of the gunpowder being used and could kick the round out a very long distance indeed, 10,000 yards, in excess of 10,000 yards.
Artillery was becoming more and more sophisticated.
Fire!
But significant problems such as recoil still remain.
Fire!
During the next 80 years, those problems would be solved with devastating effect. Big guns would soon dominate the battlefields and the oceans of the world. Early in their evolution, big guns had essentially branched off into three distinct groupings: mortar, gun, or howitzer.
Mortar lifts around in a very high arc into the target. So if there is an obstacle in between the target and the gun, or the mortar can loft the round up and over that obstacle very easily. This is opposed to the gun, which has a relatively flat trajectory. You want a flat trajectory to kick the round out long ranges. The problem with that is if there's an obstacle in between the gun and the target, you can't fire through the obstacle. A howitzer is a combination of both. It's relatively flat trajectory, but it also has the ability to loft the round by changing normally the powder increments and the elevation of the gun to either loft the round into the target or to fire it directly into the target.
The increasing power and accuracy of land and sea-based artillery was quickly becoming apparent. In particular, a new type of artillery projectile was being developed in France that would dramatically alter the nature of naval warfare.
The first attempts to destroy the enemy with explosive shells occurred about the 1830s. This jeopardized many navies throughout the world. And so the French themselves started finding an antidote to the explosive shell.
That antidote was to create an ironclad ship. Built by France in 1858, La Gloire was the world's first such vessel. It rendered the wooden navies of the world obsolete, and it instigated a major arms race. Now, a new projectile had to be found that could penetrate the thick iron sheets of ironclads.
The early projectiles fired against armored ships were nothing more than iron cannonballs. The problem was that they were very ineffective. You see great pictures of the Monitor with these big dents in the turret, but it didn't pierce the armor. You have to come up with something better. There were lots of ways to pierce the armor. One was to fire the projectile at ever higher velocities. Then you need a bigger gun. The other way to do it was to put a lead cap on the top of the projectile so that when the projectile hit the armor, it would grip the armor, allowing the penetrator to go through the armor.
To defeat the ironclads, gun makers concentrated on making the largest and strongest guns they could. Among the best were the British rifled muzzleloaders, or RMLs. And the most powerful RML was the Armstrong. In the 1870s, two enormous Armstrongs were installed to defend the British stronghold at Gibraltar. The Armstrong was a 100-ton giant with an 18-inch wide barrel. A 450-pound charge in its belly would propel a 2,000-pound piercing shell so fast that it could penetrate 21 inches of armor at 2,000 yards. But this gun was not without its problems. When the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, Sir Garnet Wolseley, went to witness a test firing of the gun at Gibraltar, one charge failed to fire. Now, the problem was how to get the projectile out of the gun. A small drummer boy was convinced to crawl down the barrel of this loaded cannon and fasten a rope to the nozzle of the shell. Moseley asked, "You understand, do you not, that there is no danger?" "Not if you say so, sir," said the boy as he crawled into the depths of the Armstrong's barrel. The shell was eventually pulled out, and the boy was quickly promoted to corporal for his bravery. Huge coastal artillery pieces like the Armstrong and so-called disappearing guns like this early 20th century design only served to accelerate the arms race. Designers strove to engineer more effective guns for their ships. Perhaps the most famous of these designers was John Ericsson. His creation, the Monitor, featured the revolutionary concept of a revolving turret.
The turret comes in during the American Civil War with the Monitor, and then it gets more and more and more sophisticated to the point where the turret itself is subdivided. You have working chambers where the projectile is put into the loading system, and if you've got a penetrating hit on the turret, if you didn't have the doors shut, then you got a tremendous explosion.
One such disaster occurred to the USS Missouri on April 13, 1904. A propellant charge that exploded in the turret quickly spread to the magazine and ignited almost half a ton of gunpowder. 32 officers and men were killed in the explosion. As a result, the inner workings of all new naval gun turrets became interlocked for safety. Land-based artillery also had several significant problems to overcome. Because of recoil, artillery pieces had to be reset and re-aimed before they could be refired. This limited the rapidity with which these guns could be fired. Then in 1897, the French Army surprised the world with a stunning technological breakthrough. They unveiled a new gun called the French 75 that could fire at a shocking rate.
The invention of the French 75 rapid-fire field gun was revolutionary. Overnight, every other cannon in the world was obsolete because now you had an artillery piece that stayed in one place and only the tube went back and forth because of the recoil. You could acquire a target and stay on target for maybe 20 or more rounds per minute. And what that meant was you could engage a target with a certainty of killing it.
It was one of the most important developments in military history, and it influenced the design of every piece of artillery produced in the 20th century. The first observers of the gun were in awe, and the French kept the mechanics of the 75 secret for years.
French 75s were very carefully guarded military secrets. Even their allies, France's allies, which included America in 1917, were not given the full information on how the gun worked. French 75s were brought to America to train American artillerymen that would go to war against Germany in World War I. Many of those artillerymen did not have a complete understanding of the French 75 because of the secrecy.
The handwriting was on the wall. Any country which didn't equip itself with a rapid-firing artillery piece like the 75 was going to find itself well behind in an ever-accelerating arms race. It was a race that was about to explode into the bloodiest and deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. In 1914, Europe was to engage in the war that was supposed to end all wars. But after only a few weeks, the Great War yielded some unfortunate surprises. Military experts thought it was going to be a mobile and quick conflict. But rapid troop advances were abruptly halted, and it soon became a long, protracted siege demanding heavier ordnance. Hundreds of thousands of men were killed each month, many of them hit by artillery shells while hunkered down in trenches.
What seems to me the most compelling indication of the kind of war World War I was the British reference to the sort of casualties that were expected on an ordinary day on the Western Front when nothing was happening. They called it wastage. During World War I on the Western Front, wastage in the British Army was 3,000 casualties a day when nothing was going on. When a battle started, the numbers climbed hugely. The first day on the Somme, 60,000.
Initially, the French thought 5,000 of its 75s would last the entire war. But after a year, half its arsenal was already destroyed. Pre-war projections had anticipated that the guns would fire only 3 shells per day. But in reality, hundreds were being fired.
The armies began digging foxholes, then they dug trenches, then they dug lines of trenches, and before you knew it, the Western Front was essentially bilateral static siege warfare. In such a situation, artillery became paramount. It was the only way that you could destroy massive earthworks. And in fact, it was the bigger guns that were necessary. The flat trajectory, lighter field guns like the French 75 would be very good at taking out individual targets such as bunkers, machine gun nests, pillboxes, that sort of thing. But for destroying massive trench works, you essentially needed siege artillery.
And that siege artillery needed to be mobile. Huge naval guns were mounted on railway carriages and transported across the front. Of these railway weapons, the German guns were generally considered the best. Perhaps the most famous big gun of World War I was Big Bertha. Named after Bertha Krupp, daughter of the German armaments maker, Big Berthas were giant guns with 11-inch bores that weighed 43 tons each and fired 1,800-pound projectiles about 9 miles. The first of these weapons was built in August 1914.
The Big Bertha was designed to take a shell of either high explosive capability or armor penetrating capability and to penetrate the most heavily armored fortress, the thickest steel, the thickest concrete, and explode around deep within that fort and set off its magazine, or by setting off tremors in the ground, literally shake it to its foundations.
Big Berthas were brought in to aid in the attack of the Liège forts of Belgium, which were considered impregnable by the greatest military minds of the day. With the help of the Big Berthas, the Germans took those forts in 3 days. Their victory stunned the world. The Germans went on to destroy every fortress which stood in their way as they advanced into Belgium and then France.
The reason Big Bertha was so effective, it fired a tremendous projectile at a very high trajectory. So the round came in at a very steep angle from the top. Most forts were protected against guns, which are flat trajectory weapons, but they weren't protected from the top. And so when these siege mortars would fire, it just blew them apart.
Later in the war, the Germans developed the legendary Paris gun, which bombarded the French capital from the incredible distance of 68 miles.
The idea was to develop a gun that would fire a shell so far that it would appear to the French citizens that the enemy was throwing artillery shells into the city and there was absolutely no way to stop it. And this was intended to cause a certain amount of panic, perhaps leading to lack of support for France's military effort.
Hitting a target as big as Paris from 68 miles away wasn't difficult, but hitting a specific target within Paris was highly problematic. To get a fix on where the Paris gun shells were hitting, German agents in Paris contacted Swiss emissaries, who in turn telegraphed Berlin, who finally contacted the gun battery in the field. The process was said to have taken some 4 hours. The shells themselves would enter the stratosphere, a height of about 8 miles. The reduced air resistance allowed them to travel a considerable distance before re-entering the atmosphere.
The problem was that at first, French civilians and even French military personnel thought that the first few shells were bombs dropped from marauding aircraft. When the French army realized that it was a very heavy, long-range gun, they were pretty quickly able to find out where the gun was located and sent planes out and brought up railroad guns to try to counteract it.
Ultimately, the Paris gun had very little strategic importance. Its primary value was as a propaganda device for the Germans. Far more destructive were poison gas shells fired by German howitzers aimed toward Allied lines.
1915, after the trenches had become solidified, once the Western Front was bogged down into a static warfare, the Germans started looking for ways to break that impasse. And one of the ways suggested was the use of poison gas.
The Germans used code names for the different gases contained in their artillery shells. Blue Cross was an arsenical smoke. Green Cross was a phosgene mixture. Yellow Cross was the most lethal of all. Mustard gas, a blistering agent that brutally attacked the respiratory system. By 1918, fully half of the artillery shells used in the war were filled with these deadly gas toxins.
The fear of gas and the use of gas was so severe between the wars that international agreements were made that no country could use poison gas again, that the world should have learned its lesson from World War I, that no more was a soldier going to go into combat fearing that he was going to die from lungs that were clogged up or eaten away by poison gases.
Even as World War I ended, new storm clouds were brewing on the horizon. Within 20 years, the dark forces of evil would sweep over Europe, and big guns would again become critical in the outcome of the war. In 1941, at the beginning of America's involvement in World War II, the country found itself lacking in almost all areas of military preparedness. A notable exception was in the development of radio communications for artillery. America was on the forefront of this technology, which allowed forward observers to communicate with an artillery piece at any time of the day or night.
The Germans in World War II were rather contemptuous with our armored fighting vehicles. I mean, the M4 Sherman is not exactly the best tank in the world. They were rather contemptuous of our infantry. They thought we were amateurs. But when it came to artillery, American artillery scared them, because any second lieutenant with a radio could call in every artillery piece within range. That was the big thing.
As the war progressed, this would prove to be a critical advantage. But the Germans were also well armed with modern artillery. The German 88 was seated on such a well-made mount that the weapon could become highly mobile and very flexible.
The German 88 started out life as an anti-aircraft gun, and it was a very effective anti-aircraft gun. And it proved to be a very, very effective anti-tank gun because it had a very high muzzle velocity. It punched through armor very easily.
Though the 88 achieved fame as an anti-tank gun, it remained the backbone of Germany's air defenses throughout the war. But the Germans also developed many other large weapons. Evolving from the designs of World War I, the big German railway guns got even bigger and more complicated. The German K5E, otherwise known as Anzio Annie, was the best railway gun ever built.
This was a 28 centimeter or 11-inch railroad gun designed with the simplest and lightest carriage that the Germans could develop. It was an immensely accurate weapon. It did require almost 3,000 people to service it, and there was a 54-car, two-section train that worked with the gun. The weapon was extremely accurate, and on a turntable, it could control an area of the battlefield almost 40 miles in diameter. There were anti-aircraft emplacements to protect it from enemy aircraft. There were infantry units. There were technical units.
The K5 fired a 561-pound shell 39 miles. A rocket-assisted shell extended the range to 53 miles. And a Peenemünde arrow shell fired from an experimental smoothbore K5 had an extraordinary range of 94 miles, the approximate distance between New York and Philadelphia. When the Allies were desperately trying to establish a beachhead at Anzio, Italy, the K5 earned its nickname Anzio Annie. The Germans defied Allied attempts to silence the gun by secretly rolling it into a railroad tunnel to avoid detection. After the danger of Allied air attack passed, the gun was wheeled out of the tunnel and firing was resumed. The distinction of the biggest gun ever made belongs to the German 80-centimeter K, otherwise known as the Gustav. The dimensions of this monster are staggering. It was over 9 stories high, weighed 1,350 tons, fired a 7-ton projectile, needed 25 trainloads of equipment, and 2 10-ton cranes to assist in construction. It took almost 5,000 men under the command of a major general up to 6 weeks to assemble. And the construction yard behind it was almost a mile long. But this gun was almost too big for its own good. It had a battlefield career of only 13 days. The Gustav fired just 48 shots in anger and was used in only one operation, against the Russian stronghold of Sebastopol in 1942.
It was very effective in taking out things like ammunition dumps that were buried 200 feet deep into the earth. However, it only fired a very limited number of rounds because it took so long to set the gun up. It took so long for them to reload the thing.
Basically a normal gun carried to extreme dimensions, the Gustav ultimately proved a monumental flop. After Sebastopol, the giant gun was dismantled and its pieces spread across Nazi-occupied Europe. The Americans were experimenting with big guns as well. Mounted on a modified tank chassis, the King Kong was the largest self-propelled howitzer ever made. But because of its impractical nature, the King Kong was never put to use in combat situations, and only a few were manufactured during the war. After the war, they were scrapped. Another big gun, the Little David, was the largest caliber gun ever made. Its 36-inch caliber barrel fired a 3,650-pound shell 6 miles. It was so large that only one was ever built.
Very late in the Okinawan campaign, it fired into the southern end of Okinawa. The problem with it is the base has to be dug into the ground. So it takes a long time to emplace this thing, and it's a very short-ranged weapon. But even bigger of a problem was the projectile that it fired was very, very inaccurate. Of course, when it hit something, it blew it all apart, but the projectile was not a very good projectile.
By the end of 1944, the Allies were closing in on the Third Reich. And a desperate Germany was experimenting with extreme weapons. Some foreshadowed the new direction of big artillery in the next half-century. Others were bizarre duds. The Vortex cannon was one of the stranger German creations.
It was devised so that it could propel a jet of air a pretty long distance. And this jet of air could disable an Allied bomber or set up currents of wind that would cause the bomber to become unstable and to crash, in theory. In practice, it never worked.
The most horrifying and prophetic weapon of the war was the V-2 rocket. The V stood for vengeance, and the Nazis used it to terrify London. The first long-range rocket ever used in warfare, the V-2 had one major limitation: its primitive guidance system.
Just at the end of World War II, you have long-range rockets like the V-2 come in, and you could hit a city the size of London with that. You could hit Antwerp with it, but you couldn't really target, say, the docks at Antwerp, which is what you really want to hit.
Nevertheless, the V-2 had opened the door for the development of weapons based on rocket technology. Eventually, decades later, this technology would become so refined and precise that an artilleryman's missile would be able to hit a single window of a specific building 500 miles away. More than 20 million people died during the course of the Second World War. The peace that emerged was overshadowed by uncertainty. Would advances in weaponry help keep the peace? Or would big guns again ignite the fires of war? A number of new challenges faced the Allied armies at the end of World War II. Coastal defenses were made obsolete by the atomic age. Military leaders asked why powerful guns were needed to defend a harbor when nuclear warheads launched from another continent could vaporize the site in an instant. In 1950, the United States decided to permanently dismantle its large gun coastal defense. This seemed to mark the final chapter to the age of big guns. Or did it? The United States Army developed a 280 millimeter atomic shell that could be fired from a special 47-ton mobile cannon, nicknamed Atomic Annie.
The atomic cannon was an attempt by the American Army to get an atomic firing cannon onto the battlefield so the Army could play in the nuclear game. The gun itself was pretty good. The problem with the weapon was that it was so big. It took two cabins, one that pulled and one that pushed, to get the gun into position. But because that gun was so big that every time it was deployed in an exercise, the other side knew where it was. You know, the Soviets weren't stupid, and they knew we had them there, and they kept their eye on them. And so anytime those things moved, they were targeted.
It was never fired in anger, but it's interesting to note that it was deployed overseas, first to Korea, finally to Germany. And there's a story told that says that when the negotiators, both the Americans and the North Koreans, were brought to view Atomic Annie, that the North Koreans were quite impressed and a little intimidated by Atomic Annie. And when the American technicians described the power and the majesty and the lethality of Atomic Annie, this 280 millimeter cannon, that helped to bring to a close the truce negotiations in a way that brought peace back to North Korea and South Korea.
Certainly the artillery shells were tested, but never under any kind of realistic conditions. We know that they will work, but we don't really know much about what would happen if they were actually used on a battlefield. And let's hope we never have to find out.
With a range of only 20 miles, Atomic Annie quickly became a dinosaur. Rockets like the Honest John or the Corporal were soon able to send larger nuclear payloads much further distances. The early 50s saw few other major innovations in artillery.
The Korean War is fought mainly with the weapons of World War II. The interesting thing about Korea is that it was almost World War I in its latter stages, because you had trench lines, you had fortified positions, and a lot of artillery. So in many ways, the Korean War in the latter stages is a throwback to World War I.
But the Vietnam War saw the rising importance of mobile artillery. Big artillery was only useful if it could be easily airlifted.
Vietnam was certainly a war that capitalized on the air mobile principle. By using large helicopters, they could now bring in to a fire support base or to deliver wherever was needed the towed artillery pieces that otherwise would be days in arriving.
Since the 1970s, one of the largest artillery weapons used by the United States military has been the 105 and 155 millimeter mobile gun. Then in 1991, it was discovered that Iraq was attempting to build an even bigger gun, the world's largest cannon, nicknamed the supergun. It took the concept of the big gun to its ultimate extreme. This 1,000 millimeter gun would have been 165 yards long and required 9 tons of propellant. Its range might have been 600 miles, far enough to have hit targets in Israel. Though it was installed at a well-camouflaged mountainous location north of Baghdad, the fact that it could not be moved made it extremely vulnerable.
The problem with that gun was it's fixed into position. And anything that's fixed is going to fire maybe once or twice, and then it's going to get a laser-guided bomb down the muzzle.
Fortunately, the gun's parts were destroyed by UN inspectors in 1991. Today's big guns are not nearly as large as the Gustav or the King Kong, yet they are many times more effective. Computerization and the use of the global positioning system have revolutionized artillery tactics.
We have now 6 models of the 109 howitzer. The A6, the 6th model is in fact the Paladin howitzer that is able to self-locate itself based upon gyroscope technology that is embedded inside the howitzer. So when the howitzer stops, it knows exactly where it is on the battlefield. And that's important to us because that's part of the equation that you must compute in order to have indirect fire be responsive and be accurate.
The Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS, was first used in Operation Desert Storm. The Iraqis called it Steel Rain. Its surface-to-surface ballistic rockets, which have a range of 28 miles, could put more than 2 tons of destructive firepower on a target in 1 minute. The Army Tactical Missile System was used against high-priority targets during Desert Storm. Each missile has 950 bomblets, which disperse over a target area, detonate on impact, and can defeat company-sized targets beyond the range of current Army cannons and rockets. Other weapon systems are being developed today for the battlefields of the future.
The electromagnetic railgun is a device that uses electromagnetic charge to propel an extremely small projectile at such a high velocity that even a round the size of a table-sized salt shaker could penetrate many, many inches of armor.
You're probably going to see something like a liquid propellant, where you ram the round into the tube, close the breech, and then a liquid propellant will be injected into the gun chamber, and it will be fired.
We're talking about an onboard computer system that can mate the exact projectile with the correct fuse and the correct powder at the push of a button. We're talking about ammunition that the members of the crew would never touch from the time it is loaded in the ammunition support vehicle until it's fired.
For 700 years, people have sought more effective ways to use the powerful force of large guns. This journey has taken man to the frontiers of scientific understanding, but sometimes these giant weapons have encouraged men to wage war. And sometimes they have been the only way to maintain the peace.